Welcome everybody to our 15th ARCI video meeting. It's hard to believe we've done 14 of these, and I think they've been pretty successful, and I think we're going to continue that streak. So if you look on the screen, you'll see that we've got some meetings coming up in November and December, but next year we've taken a slightly different approach in that we're not going to do as many meetings. We're going to cut back a bit and not do these meetings in the months that we have swap meets. And then we're going to take the summer off because we learned that once the virus kind of abated a little bit, we found that a lot of people started traveling and going to swap meets and not being around. And so it was difficult during the summer months this past year to kind of keep this going and have enough presentations. So we're going to cut back to about 5 or 6 next year. And we welcome your feedback at that email address there as far as what you'd like to see or comments of any sort. And I would like to have you consider doing a presentation. We've got some great presenters thus far, and again, today we'll have a great lineup here, but we need more. We need future presentations. So Matt will put up a poll later on in the meeting that asks you if you'd like to be a presenter, and please consider doing so. The protocol for these meetings is pretty simple. It's basically, if you're not a presenter, just be on mute so that the presenter can have a nice audio feed going. And if you have questions, the presenter will open up the floor for questions. So it's pretty simple. I'll note that we are recording this and we put it on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt, and he'll talk a bit about what it means to be on YouTube.
Thanks. And the usual considerations are that since we are on YouTube, remember that anyone on YouTube will hear or see what you present. So it's not a good place to put information like directions to your house. A better place for that is the chat. And in a little bit, I'm going to be adding the registration link for next month's ARCI online meet. And I will also be adding the link for tomorrow's auction for Mark that they're doing in Davidsonville. And this auction, I just want to note, is not live for participation. It's more it is live, but it's just a view. If you're looking to participate, you have to find somebody over there to be your proxy and bid and pay for you. Anyway, the main item is that YouTube is very persnickety about copyrighted material, especially music. So if you have a video or are demonstrating a radio, please don't put it on a music station, because otherwise, when that plays, we'll get a copyright strike against our video, and that can have serious implications for us. So that's it. With that, I will turn it back over to Tom after and launch the poll.
So our agenda today, you can see we have 3 presentations. After we do the presentations, we'll have a show and tell session. People can talk about whatever they want. Looks like we have at least 2 of those. And then we'll have a brief update on our swap meet that we just had, and when the next one is, and then we have a items wanted, items for sale session, and then an open session. So that's what's going to happen today. So first, I'd like to mention that today we have 3 presentations. The first 2 basically are historical type presentations, and the third is a restoration type presentation. We found that over the course of doing these, that the people that watch these have told us that they like to hear about the history of companies and the history of the technology. And in keeping in line with that, liking, we're going to today have a presentation about RCA. If you've been watching some of these over the past year, we've had people show their collections of early RCA radios and specifically the areolas. And we've had a lot of discussions about the history of RCA and such an impact it's had. Well, today we're going to have a presentation by Gary Hoover called Tech Wars, RCA in the Television Industry. And Gary has been a contributor to our newsletter, and he put this article in the April edition of the ARCI newsletter. And just recently in the October issue, he did one on Westinghouse. His articles are excellent, and they have a very unique perspective because Gary is a very successful businessman and entrepreneur, and he's done a lot of things, and he's got his own website, his own YouTube channel. He's got these great titles of Executive Director of the American Business History Center. And the one I like is that you are a entrepreneur in residence, School of Information at the University of Texas at Austin. So Gary, prepare to give us some information, and we're going to sit back and enjoy your presentation.
Okay, well, great. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I hope the University of Texas at Austin does a little better today against Oklahoma State than they did against Oklahoma last weekend. If any of you follow college football coming up today. So a little background on me. I grew up in Anderson, Indiana, outside of Indianapolis, a General Motors factory town, a city of 60,000 people with 27,000 GM workers. And it was the electrical part of General Motors. So all the Delco, the alternators, ignitions, starters, headlights, taillights, 27,000 people working at GM in a town of 60,000. But it was the base of the Delco operation. So the radios were made in either Kokomo or Marion. The batteries were made in Muncie, all those medium-sized Indiana towns. And then I went to the University of Chicago and studied economics under all those guys up there that later won Nobel Prizes in jazz. But growing up in GM factory town, nobody could answer my questions about General Motors. You know, we'd be learning about leaders and governors, presidents, generals, how they led, their strategies, really about management, leadership. And I thought, well, this is all fascinating. And then I say, well, what about General Motors? It's kind of the gorilla in the town or whatever. And nobody, so oh, they make Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, Olds, Cadillac, GMC truck, Frigidaire, you know, Delco radios. And I said, well, we all know that, you know, everybody in town works there. You know, who started it? Why did they start it? And nobody could answer my questions. I was in a newsstand with my family. My brother was looking at the airplane and car magazines. My big sister was looking at the horse and dog magazines. And I discovered Fortune, the great American business magazine, and went around to my parents and said, you got to get me a subscriptions magazine, you know, and it's the greatest thing I've ever seen because it talked about General Motors, their annual list of the 500 biggest companies in America. General Motors was at the top of the list for 40 some years or whatever, you know, and my parents said, oh, what a weird kid, you know, why don't you go play basketball like a normal Indiana kid? Anyway, got my subscription to Fortune, and 2 months later, I entered the 7th grade. So I started subscribing to Fortune when I was 12. In 1963, I now live in a library of 60,000 books, including all the Fortunes back to the beginning in 1930. I was reading one last night from 1935, I believe, about the radio industry. It was a big article about Philco, actually. And then I went on a life of picking stocks on Wall Street and learning how to be a retailer, working for big retail companies, and then teach entrepreneurship now. But when you study business history, if you Google business history, like nothing comes up. You know, any other subject under the sun, Atwater, Kent, or some weird sort of bird or a little town in Siberia, you know, it's all over the internet, maybe 6 websites or something. But nothing about business history. And I think it cost our society literally billions of dollars to make the same mistakes over and over and all that. And since I've been fascinated by it for whatever that all works out to, like 50 years or something, I said, well, I'm the guy to start something. So my friends and I, 2.5 years ago, so it's americanbusinesshistory.org. And on that, we write a free weekly newsletter. I urge you to subscribe, an email newsletter. I think the 118th issue just came out. We gave prizes. We had students write essays on the history of a local company and gave out like $7,000 in prizes. We just finished that to try to get young people interested in learning about business, because studying the history is really the best way to understand business and entrepreneurship. And in the midst of all that, the companies I founded, one was called Bookstop. That was the first chain of giant bookstores. We were coast to coast, and Barnes & Noble bought us. It's how they got in the big bookstore business. Another company called Hoover, it's my name, is the #1 site on the web for information about companies. And it went public, and Dun & Bradstreet bought that. And then I lost all my money on my third venture, The Life of the Entrepreneur. So anyway, that's, RCA is a company I grew up with and everything. And I've always been fascinated, really, first with the broadcasting industry. I've got a video, history of media on our website, if you look on the videos page. And it's really the story of Henry Luce, who created Time, Life, Fortune, Sports Illustrated, and the story of Bill Paley, who, bought CBS in his 20s and took it from being almost a nothing to rivaling NBC and then surpassing NBC in most of the television age. That's all in that video. It's like an hour-long video, history of the industry. And I've done also histories of the airline industry, computers, retailing, automobiles, and one other industry. But, our RCA, it was the U.S. government, the Navy, because radio was really for ship to shore. And you guys know a lot more about this than I do, so correct me if I've gotten anything wrong. But, radio was, we can talk to the ships. And old Marconi, and then he and his mom went to England and incorporated the company and everything. British Marconi owned all those patents. And as much as we like the British, we didn't like them enough to think they should control our communication system. So basically, the General Electric guys, who are also in there, got together with the Navy and the government and said, well, we're going to create an American, basically a government-based monopoly in a sense, or, super powerful company. And parallel would be Pan American World Airways, where, they were almost a part of the State Department. No other American-based airline had major international flying rights. Pan Am kept them all until after World War II, and TWA broke in, and a few of the others had a few routes. But so RCA, and it was AT&T, Westinghouse, GE, and United Fruit, which had operated radio communications for their ships, picking up bananas in Central America, from the banana republics. They pooled all their operations and pooled their patents, and it had everything, and nobody could touch it, and all that jazz. And Sarnoff, who his whole life talked about how he was working in Wanamaker department store, and because of department stores, they created a lot of the first radio stations, WOR, I think it was, at Bamberger's, and WLS, world's largest store, but that wasn't Marshall Field's, it was Sears there in Chicago. But department stores all over the country, and it was a promotional gimmick and helped sell radios when they came in later. But he took in the message from the Titanic, and as a kid, and barely spoke English or whatever, the whole legend. There are a lot of books on Sarnoff's life. And of course, I wouldn't give him much power because he was such a foreigner with an accent. So I forget his initial title, but he's there, and they're all thinking military uses and all that. And he's saying, no, we can use this radio thing to, like, people can stay at home and listen to music, And he went to great lengths to sign up symphonies and all that. And they didn't really believe him, the bosses. But over time, he was proven right. He was energetic. He was smart. And he became the head of RCA. And then, what was it? I guess 1919, they created it. 1930, the government realized, they're getting too powerful or whatever, and all these big companies, and actually made AT&T and Westinghouse and GE sell off their stock because they had owned RCA, and made them, separate it out. And then Sarnoff finally had his own company in total freedom. And you folks know all about their, had all these patents and charged all everybody else royalties. But, like anything, any booming new technology, the internet and everything, it took off. Of course, KDKA from Westinghouse in Pittsburgh. And that's a great story, too. And as mentioned, I have an article, really the biography of George Westinghouse. So his life was really before all the radio stuff, but you know, that was like an engineer experimenting, and he actually had the station at his house and everything. And it was, I think the head of Westinghouse was in a department store in Pittsburgh, and he saw a display of radios, and he's like, well, maybe that guy's right. Maybe we should get in this business. And, you know, and if you study Westinghouse, you know, it morphed eventually, and they bought CBS. They sold all the old stuff except for the stations like Whoa, Fort Wayne in Indiana, where I'm from, and became a broadcasting, and then it's been through a whole lot of change, but and all their great old Westinghouse Electric and all that got, although Westinghouse himself, he lost control of that to Eastern Financiers in one of the early financial struggles. You know, we've had a lot of recessions and depressions besides the 1930s, and ones that people, the 1907 one and the 1873 one, and 1893 one, the big one in 2021 that almost bankrupted both Sears and General Motors. Both almost went out of business. People never talk about that one. But in one of those downdrafts, Westinghouse lost control of that. But and I was just reading. Let's see if I can a quote here. I don't want to get it wrong. Atwater Kent Grigsby Grunow, I pronounce that right, started making sets in 1928, became the leader in 1929, and failed in 1934. You know, Atwater Kent leapt to the top position in 1930 and withdrew 2 years later because of the Depression. But you know, Mr. Atwater or Kent, whatever, you know, he retired multimillionaire, big mansion. I may have included a picture of his house. I've got it somewhere. There in Philadelphia. And of course, Crosley, one of my heroes. I grew up going to Cincinnati Reds games. Sorry, all you Cubs and White Sox fans. You know, he's an amazing guy. And I wrote his biography up too, but he became powerful, and then they kind of drifted off and came back. And but let's see, the first licenses, because RCA should have kind of had it all, but all these other people, depending on which numbers I look at, 600 to 1,000 different radio manufacturers, of which only something like 18 survived 10 years later. But in the 20s and 30s, you know, it went nuts. And I think the first license RCA gave was Zenith, you know, a little Chicago outfit. And then I was surprised it was Crosley and then Atwater Kent. And then the next year, because they were limiting how many licenses they were giving, Philco, Philadelphia Storage Battery Company, had to buy another company and get their license. And you know, it's hard to find. I'm always interested in market shares. Who was the leader, when, and why? How did they rise and fall? And Philco was very aggressive, and they all, you know, Emerson came along, and then you got all the guys that were selling for Sears and for Ward's, which were huge numbers, and also Western Auto and the Firestone stores, according to the numbers that I've got here, were moving huge quantities of radios. Philco, according to the numbers I was looking at last night in the old Fortune, Philco was actually number one, at least briefly, in the mid-30s. But by 1941, RCA was still the biggest producer. And somewhere here I got the numbers, but they were cranking out, it was a million, close, here we go, 1940, RCA 1.7 million sets, Philco 1.675 million. Then Zenith at 1 million, Emerson at 1 million, mostly midget sets, and then Galvin, which of course became Motorola, 950,000, but that includes their car radios. And they had at least a third of that market, maybe more. They were the biggest producer. And then Colonial and Belmont, who were making radios for the chain stores, and Noblet Sparks, I think was a chain store producer, you know, so not necessarily under their own name, and then GE, Crosley, and smaller companies. Total of almost 12 million radios sold. So RCA and Philco had around 15% each of the market. But you know how it evolved, and then the tail end of that, I'm not watching my time very closely, the tail end of that RCA story, or the long part, was you know, became the greatest consumer electronics maker in the world, and led with television and then color television. But at some point, the federal government said, "Oh, you're too powerful. You're too powerful. You have to give your patents, you know, royalty free to all your American competitors. You can sell to overseas people, but we got to protect the American industry, and and dethrone the giant, And so what happens is RCA people say, well, it's no longer worth a lot for us to keep inventing stuff. We're going to have to give our good ideas away after we invest all that money in them at the Sarnoff, labs or research center, whatever they call it in New Jersey, I think. And so we're not going to keep pioneering as much. And they did the laser disc thing, and they lost a lot of battles when they were in them. And then the other thing is they said, well, guys, we can still collect royalties overseas. So they marched over to Japan, and Sony and Matsushita, the Panasonic people and everything, they earned royalties. RCA got royalties from them. So they boosted those guys. And at the same time, this was really up to the 1960s, the conglomerate era hit, which was all the vogue on Wall Street by all different companies, different industries. RCA bought Random House Publishing. They bought Hertz. Rent-A-Car, they bought a great Chicago history company. John Hertz, amazing guy, if you ever study him. Created a yellow cab, created what became GMC truck. Amazing guy. And they bought a carpet maker, and it was Sarnoff's son running it. Robert, right? Yeah. And the whole idea really didn't work. It worked for a while, but the conglomerate era ended, and all those great conglomerates, ITT, Gulf and Western, Lit, and all of them, they were all pulled apart. Beatrice Foods, I wrote up the story of Beatrice Foods, a great Chicago company, on our website, and that was one of the biggest conglomerates that bought. He was buying like a company a week in their glory days, and then after the old boy retired, they broke it into pieces. They brought Dannon yogurt to the U.S. and all this jazz. So, but old Robert Sarnoff got caught up in that. So they basically started ignoring consumer electronics, and went into decline, and the Japanese didn't feel that way. And then it was really ironic, because while the government made GE sell their RCA stock, then later GE buys RCA, and they sell the consumer electronics thing to Thomson of France, which was a descendant of Thomson Houston, which was the key part of General Electric when it was founded. That was the merger of Edison's interest with Thomson Houston. And when JP Morgan put GE together, I think 1892, they got rid of Edison as quick as they could, not the greatest businessman, amazing inventor, mixed record as a businessman, but not. And they turned it over to Charles Coffin, the guy that ran Thomson Houston. And he really was the one that made GE the big, powerful company it was in its glory days. And now we see GE, which kind of lost its way as an electrical-based technology company, got into finance and everything, got all messed up, and stock collapsed. The company's in deep trouble, and they got a new leader who's doing a good job and trying to get it refocused. But all that history, it all ties together. So those are just some general thoughts and things. So I don't know the best way to do it. Anybody have any questions or further thoughts, or correct me on something I said, or I'm at your guys' pleasure.
Well, thank you, Gary, for that presentation. What was your take on the way that RCA got through the war years?
I haven't studied it as much in depth, but I can tell you right now I'm working on a big story about General Motors and Alfred Sloan, the man who really made it a great company. And, every American manufacturing company, we couldn't have won the war without those people. General Motors was the biggest defense contractor. It's kind of ironic that the biggest pure defense company was a company called Curtiss-Wright, descended from Glenn Curtiss and the Wright brothers. And yet it went away after World War II. They paid out everything in dividends and didn't look at the future. And Curtiss-Wright disappeared. So that's kind of ironic. But government had money and they wanted to do radar and all this cool stuff. And everybody was in it. The book I just mentioned, I was reading about history of the radio industry. They talk of, or one of them, I got two books right here, was talking about Raytheon, which was just like a tiny company, barely existed. And as you know now, well, they're one of the two or three giant defense contractors with Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics, maybe four giants, but Raytheon just took over the old Pratt & Whitney jet engine business, is now part of the new Raytheon. you know, it was, but a lot of them like GM, Ford, and all those people, they didn't want to do it. A lot of them really held out. Well, Henry Ford, you know, unusual, eccentric guy. He was a pacifist and didn't want to get into war. And the guy that sold him Lincoln quit over it because he was more ready to go, at least go help the British early on in World War II. But to transition from consumer products to entirely military needs was really difficult. They had to stop making cars, you know, they went, and television. I had that in my story. That was put on hold. They were making good progress. In 1941, they'd introduced it at the New York World's Fair. RCA did in 1939-40, but then they had to stop and do nothing. And then, of course, really 1948, 49, 50, 51 was when television really took off, first in New York City and in other places. But so I don't have a lot of depth on their specifics, or if I read them, I've already forgotten of all their activities in World War II. But hey, everybody was doing everything they could. The president of General Motors became the head of the War Production Board for a while to organize American industry. Kind of upset his old GM colleagues because he wouldn't give them any preferences or anything. He was a hard ass. Great man, Williams Knudsen, spoke with a Norwegian accent.
Well, that's great to hear your perspective on RCA, Gary. And as I said earlier, your articles that you've written for the newsletter are very informative and well researched. So
I hope to do at least Philco and Zenith in the history in the future. I was just talking to a friend last night about, hey, we ought to do Philco because that's a very interesting story. Of course, Ford bought them. And I like the other companies too. You know, I'd love to know. I remember going to the Atwater Kent Museum in Philadelphia. You know, it's named after him. It's their local history of Philadelphia industries, which of course is enormous. You know, it's a manufacturing center of the world, one of them, with New York and Stetson hats and everything is, you know, Sunoco gasoline, everything you can mention. But it's the Atwater Kent. It may have been their old offices. I'm not sure. It's been a few years since I've been there. But so over time, you know, we keep writing a new company story or a new article every week. So I'm sure I will return to consumer electronics in general many times. And in all that, if you do flow over into television, one of my favorite stories is Admiral and Ross Siragusa from Chicago, you know, and amazing. You can find a PDF online. I think it's at the Ross Siragusa Foundation, the money he left. It's his story and biography. And, you know, he was a character, and man, they took off and their sales tripled in 3 years or whatever and became a major TV producer. And I mean, so all the old appliance companies, even what we call the white goods companies, the histories of Whirlpool and Maytag and Amana and a lot of great Midwestern companies. So, yeah, we'll just keep cranking them out. So go subscribe to our newsletter. And the more our business, I've been on the History Channel a bunch recently about the auto industry, the food industry, and several others. And our traffic on our website and newsletter readership has really skyrocketed over the last 6 months. So we're really beginning to reach an audience. We're up like, we're doing like 5 or 6 times as much website traffic as we were a year ago at this time. So finally getting more and more people to realize, hey, you can learn something from these old stories and maybe not repeat their mistakes and maybe learn from their successes.
Well, that's very good, Gary. I appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you for having me.
Are there any other questions for Gary this morning?
And you can always email me. Just hit the contact button. Right? You know, Tom has my email address. You're more than welcome to share that. And
yeah, well, we look forward to your future articles, especially Philco and perhaps Admiral showing up in our newsletter. So
that'd be great.
Would you consider doing something on Emerson? There's a dearth of information.
Oh yeah, I lived in St. Louis. That was one of the when I was in retailing, and Emerson, and I think maybe the head of Emerson was on our board of the May Department Stores Company that later briefly owned Marshall Fields. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting company. Yeah, I might move them up on the list because of all the companies we've talked about, aren't they probably the most successful today, still going? Because they have an incredible track record.
Yeah.
Last I looked, I always have to update and see, well, how are they doing right now and how did they do in 2020? But yeah, Emerson is a powerhouse, a very interesting company. And if you get into small consumer electronics, McGraw Edison which made Toastmaster and I think Zero Fans, and very interesting, kind of under the radar, but it was a public company that was a major force in small electrics or traffic appliances, as was a big powerhouse with Sunbeam out of Chicago, which was run by a guy, Gwynn, from my hometown in Indiana, who later ran the Encyclopedia Britannica and was a trustee of the University of Chicago. But he was a guy that really made Sunbeam successful in the 50s and 60s.
Gary,
Yes.
I don't know if you mentioned Marconi, and I don't know how long you've been on these Zoom meetings, but you can look on the YouTube channel. We visited South Wellfleet on vacation about 10 years ago, and I've got some pictures of the well, what remains of the Marconi site. So it was.
I'll have to look that up.
ARCI members, was that like in February or April? It was earlier this year, in the first half of the year sometime. So check it out on the YouTube channel.
Oh yeah, no, I'll do that. I have not looked back through them, but no, he was something else. And
yeah.
You know, of course, the whole science of it is almost a whole nother world in terms of, you know, when you get to television and Farnsworth and Zworkin or whatever you call, and then Armstrong and FM. I mean, I with these 60,000 books, I have 34 rooms. Each room's a different subject. But one of them I call media history. So that includes recording industry, movies, magazines, newspapers. But a huge amount is about broadcasting. I have the old broadcasting yearbooks and radio yearbooks. And I'm sure, you know, there's a website where they put up PDFs of all the old broadcasting magazines. I think all of them. It's just wonderful. It's referenced. We have a links page on our American Business History Center, and it's referenced there. But and I've done, like I say, a lot more, you know, studying broadcasting and how it evolved, which has its own stories. But then the whole science and all the battles, the patent battles. If you enjoy technology, my favorite story on our website might be the biography of George Eastman, the Kodak man. And my title, when I make the case that he was the greatest technology entrepreneur in American history, because unlike most these young computer entrepreneurs these days and most everybody else, he was the total thing. He was one of the greatest marketers of all time. He was an inventor, and he built one of the greatest companies ever built in American history. At one point, it was worth more than IBM and everything. I mean, it's just an amazing, amazing company. And he was not a one-man show, you know, it took tens of thousands. It was the highest paying guy. They were never unionized because the unions couldn't get in the door because he paid so much. Made all his secretary, made millions. Just an amazing, and has an interesting twist in his ending. You'll have to read this story to see the end of his life. But
yeah, we should check out Gary's website, the
AmericanBusinessHistory.org.
And I think that's a good thing we could put in the chat window, and that way we could follow that that link.
Look up old Eastman, George Eastman. I mean, he's one of the all-time greats.
Okay. Any other comments or questions for Gary this morning?
Gary, I was just going to say, if you want to stay to the open session at the end, you could have a very healthy debate about
Many topics.
Many topics in radio technology with this group.
Yeah.
And key players.
Well, I may listen in. I may have to run. I may listen in. I'm waiting.
All right. Well, thank you. And our next presentation is by Robert Lozier. He needs no introduction if you've been attending these meetings. He generously offered this short presentation up a few days ago to help fill out our agenda. And today he's going to talk about the first brand name radio made in North Carolina. So Robert, you ready to go there?
I can slow down. I'm not nearly as verbose as our previous presenter here. So, there's an automatic timer going in here. But and I'm not sure how to defeat that. But the vintage radio item I want to talk about is made by the High Grade Wireless Instrument Company. And it's called the Model HS2 of late 1922. And this turns out, is the very best I can determine, is this is the first brand name radio to have been made in the state of North Carolina in sometime in middle 1922. The only advertising I've found are some little newspaper cuts, advertising cuts, and using, this is generic artwork that you'll find in many newspapers throughout the country. I'm going to donate this radio to a little Asheville Radio Museum, which has been at the local technical college for the last 20 years. So I'm going to remark that Asheville's first brand name radio returns home after 99 years. It's easy to say, North Carolina was not been the hotbed of radio manufacture in the 1920s. And as far as I can know, after 50 years of being living in the area, there are only two other identifiable 1920s radios. One was called the Jewel Master Model Radio, made by the Jewel Radio Company in Henderson, North Carolina, which happens to be right up near the Virginia border north of Raleigh. And there are two of these reported, but nobody wants to say who owns them. So I don't know if they're still around, if they're still appreciated or not. And then the other one is, which cleaned up pretty nice. It's in my collection. And it's called the National and manufactured by the Mills Radio Corporation, Raleigh, North Carolina. And the circuitry in it says that it was late 1923 or 1924. There's only one known of those. So we get to back to the High Grade Wireless Instrument Company radio, and note that the arrow points to a 8-point terminal board behind the tuning capacitor. And with two jumpers, factory connected, I presume, the receiver was a legal straight detector and two-stage audio amplifier outfit. But all the customer had to do was to move the jumpers to make it a much better performing unlicensed regenerative receiver. And my question would be is, do you know of any other brands that provided such a, quote, convenient hookup terminal arrangement to circumvent their legality? The museum docents at this museum are, in my opinion, notorious for wanting to have their radios working, quote, working. And so I'm a semi-purist, and I decided that I'm not going to remove the two defective audio transformers just to make the set work. And those are the correct original transformers. And my solution is to hide in slips of black paper two of my SST-1D transformer emulators. These are solid state devices that provide the same voltage gain. You can program them for the either say a 3-to-1 or 3.5-to-1 or 5-to-1 ratios, and with just changing two resistors. And so they're hidden up there. You can see a red arrow, and you've got to look pretty close to even see that there's something else doing the job in there. but the radio performs as original, and that'll make them happy. And but one of the things is that the original wiring is still in place, and it's only, the wiring is only displaced by 1/10 of an inch. The way I do that is on the wires from the defective part that you need to disconnect. There's a little tiny chiclet of double-sided printed circuit board material, and you flow solder one side of the circuit board material to your active circuit. And then the old defective point, you tack solder to the other side, so the wire stays in place. It's only displaced by less than 1/10 of an inch. And you put a little dot of gray paint over that, and you can't tell it that it's there. And the good thing about this is that if this set ever winds up in the Smithsonian Institute, they're not going to look kindly upon modifications made to make it work. And so the great thing about this technique is that it's completely reversible. All the wiring is in the original lengths and in the same relative position. So it's easy to put that back. One of the things that I might want to comment on is one of my pet peeves, especially in 1920s radios, where you can lift the lid and see that all the wonderful hardware inside is, I know that during cleaning and all that, people are going to find old corroded solder joints that need to be resoldered in order for the radio to work. And it bugs the heck out of me to see bright, shiny solder joints throughout the radio. Well, this particular radio, in order for me to work my little subterfuge of hiding the parts in there, I had to demolish the radio. And so when I put everything back together, it had bright, shiny solder joints on there, like in number 1 there. And so I've taken in recent years to where I'll just take a jeweler's scratch brush and just scuff the surface of my bright, shiny solder, and just to dull down the gloss. But what really looks great is to take a product that used in the jewelry trade, made by Jack's Chemicals, and they have something called iron, steel, and nickel blackener. Well, it'll also darken and oxidize solder. So you take a little dot of a drop of and put it on a Q-tip and apply it to your unit. And in about 90 seconds, you'll have it looking like it's 90 years old. But the good news is it won't make things worse. It's not like the corrosion that you see from an alkaline battery in your transistor radio. But it works great to wind up making the solder joints match those of the rest of the radio. And so it doesn't draw attention to whatever you had to do in order to make the radio work. So that's something that I try to do in all my restorations now of 20s vintage radios. And finally, I don't know if Steve Mucko is on here today, but there are 2 of these radios, and one of them turned up in I believe the Mucko estate sale. And the guy that acquired it, he thought it was all legitimate, but when you take the front knobs off, you see this horrendous kludging of the thing to make the tuner portions, you see, are completely different. And they don't have that terminal board used to make it a regenerator. So this, I believe, from close examination, means that somebody in the 1960s or 1970s found this partial radio and found parts that they could kludge in to make it a regenerative receiver and make it marketable. And but the one good thing about finding this second unit is I was able to say, yes, the audio transformers that are in my set are legitimate, and the rest of the wiring and for the sockets and the rheostats is all legitimate. So it helped to validate the accuracy of the set that I'm going to present. So those are really my only comments for today.
Well, Robert, I would call that more than just comments. I'd call that an awesome presentation.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry. That means I went over.
No, you did just fine in terms of time. That was excellent. And I'm really impressed with your attention to detail and the museum quality work that you did there. That's pretty cool.
I could see you showing some people who do restorations at museums tips and tricks.
Well, the main thing is that in the hobby, it's people like to get stuff going and they don't really worry about stuff like this. But the few people that go to college and get their advanced degrees so that they can become a museum director of the Smithsonian or whatever, that limited number of people are going to say, yes, this is all fine that you got it working and everything, but you're not paying enough respect to the original intent of the makers. And so we don't want history to be like river rocks, where the more water that flows over them, the rounder they get, and the less sure you know what the original was. So that's my thing, even if it's a minority thing in the vintage radio hobby.
Yeah, and you're also dealing with extremely rare, one-of-a-kind type radios.
Yes.
It's not like my Philco, which they made 100,000 of, you know.
Right. And I say, whenever somebody gets a basket case or an ordinary radio, as you mentioned, by ordinary meaning still there's more than one around, then by all means have fun doing whatever you want to make it, because a lot of those items have already gone through repair shops where they made expedient repairs, because that was their business, is to get it in and get it out and get paid. And so those were no longer pure historical references. So by all means, do whatever you want to bring them up to something that you'll enjoy.
Okay, any questions for Robert before we move on? Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
I was going to say, can you put in the comments the that Jack's chemical that you use to dull the solder joints? I'd like to pick up a bottle of that.
I'll mute myself and I'll find the URL for that and drop it in the chat.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Our next presenter needs no introduction because it's me. I'll bring up my screen here. Unlike Robert's one of a kind, I think this Philco that I restored was probably made in the tens of thousands. But today I'm going to talk about this job I did restoring this Philco radio, the before and after you can see on your screen there. And this presentation is more of a kind of a photo journey through the things I did. Maybe it's inspirational to get you to go out and restore a radio. Maybe you might see some techniques in there that can help. But this radio, I restored the cabinet about a year ago, and then finally this summer I did the chassis. So on the left, you can see what it looked like when I got it. And when it cleaned up very nicely. And I'll do a little history here first about this radio. It was made in 1938. And as everybody probably knows, Philco was really good about their model numbers. 3812 means it was made in 1938. And they made this chassis into two different radios. They did a 3812T, which is the one I just restored. And then on the right, there's a 3812C, which I picked up from the ARCI auction, or from Tom's pile of stuff earlier this spring. And you can see it's the same chassis inside, but the cabinets are a little bit different. What's really nice about this radio is the use of veneer. As you can see, there's veneer trim here and here that's different. Philco also used this cabinet style here on the left, this wraparound grill, in a more expensive shortwave version, the 3814T and the 3815T. The one on the right was the cheaper model, and they also painted it white. They probably did that to the ones that had crummy veneer or something, but that's what Philco did. So when I got this thing, the chassis was in pretty good shape, and it was a little bit dusty, and I decided to do the cabinet first. You can see the tube complement in there. There's 5 tubes. It's AM broadcast band only. And the first thing I did was assess the condition of the cabinet veneer, and it was actually in very good shape veneer-wise. There was a couple of pieces on the top that needed a bit of repair. The grill cloth was totally shot, and the bottom had a unique duct tape trim job that I removed. I didn't think that was original. Now, I'm a fan of removing old finishes mechanically if it can be done easily. And if the finishes are brittle, I scrape them off. And you know, I wouldn't do that anything that was softwood like pine, but on a hardwood like walnut, it doesn't harm the wood. And so that's what I did with this particular radio. And I also pointed out the fact that the pilot light actually created a dark spot through the front of the veneer, and that just doesn't come out. It's kind of like a cigarette burn, but it wasn't so bad. But a little bit of sandpaper after you scrape, and the finish is removed, and it's nice and smooth. And one advantage to using a mechanical means versus stripper is if there's a grain filler in the grain, it doesn't come out. And that saves a step if you're trying to make a smoother finish and use less coats of lacquer. Stripper's great. It's just kind of messy and hazardous to your health. So I made a little video of how I remove the finish mechanically, and I did this on a bigger cabinet, and I used a cabinet scraper. And I apologize for the quality of the video because I was holding the phone with my left hand and scraping with the right hand, and big cabinet was kind of braced against me. So I think this should play. So, you know, if I can do this one-handed, I can do a better job two-handed. So that's the technique I used, and I didn't intend this presentation to be a detailed wood finishing thing. I just wanted to show you the technique I used. So I'll move on to the veneer repair. After I scraped it, I sanded it, and then I patched the small areas where the veneer was damaged. And I'm not an expert at this. Every time I approach this, I do it a little bit differently. And so my recommendation, if you attempt this, is to go do some research on the web. It's a great resource. And what I did is, in the case of the one area, I just made a template and with a piece of paper, and then I taped that paper to a piece of veneer, and then I cut it out and sanded the edges. I put the veneer on a piece of Scotch tape so the cutting process wouldn't separate the little piece of veneer, because small pieces like that tend to split apart. And I tried to sand the edges of the pieces at an angle so that when you put the two pieces together, it's kind of a bevel overlap and it looks a little cleaner. And then I glued it on the back, and then the front piece, I cut out a notch for the repair piece there. So those are the only two areas I had to do it. And you can see it kind of sticks out a little bit. It's not a horrible thing, but after I put some toning lacquer over the top, you can see on the bottom there, it doesn't really stick out too much. But it's a way to take a radio with a piece of damaged veneer and make it look better. You could use wood putty there, but it might look a little weird because it doesn't have any grain in it. One other thing that I'll point out here is I didn't use any wood stain. Whenever I have a radio that has a lot of contrasting veneer, I don't like to use wood stain because then it kind of makes everything look the same color. By just using clear lacquer and then maybe some toning lacquer to cover up the tone mismatch there. If I just use clear lacquer, then the wood grain really jumps out on all the contrasting pieces of veneer. So then on the inside of the cabinet, I had to repair the piece of cardboard that held the grill cloth. And so I created a template, or I created a new piece of cardboard that laid right over the old piece, glued it together, and then reinforced it with some more cardboard. And since it kind of looked funny, I went and got some wood stain. I used this alcohol-based wood stain. It dries in like a minute. It's great stuff, and made the cardboard kind of look dark. And so you didn't see the gray cardboard. And then I got a piece of grill cloth that I had laying around, and I used this Gorilla Spray adhesive, which seemed to work pretty good because it's not like a true contact adhesive where when you put it together, it doesn't come apart. You can actually reattach this stuff a few times, and it worked pretty well. So that's how I repaired the inside, and then installed that inside the radio. And this picture here shows you the contrasting veneers quite well. You can see this piece here really stands out nicely. And then what wasn't really apparent at the start was that this piece on the right is actually a totally different piece of veneer than this piece on the left. And of course, the piece on the top has got a nice stripe. So it turned out really beautiful. So then I went to the chassis, and what was interesting about it, there was no sign of any earlier recapping. The original capacitors, filter capacitors are right there, and you can see there's some corrosion on this one. The only sign that somebody had been in there was this more modern carbon resistor right here. So it's kind of interesting to find a radio that no one has touched service-wise. The nice thing about this particular radio is there wasn't any rubber-coated wire. Philco used that occasionally, and when you find deteriorating rubber-coated wire, you know you got a big job ahead of you. So what I did is I took the corrosion off the filter caps and detached the wires from there, and then I installed the terminal strip. And I know the Smithsonian would not like that. That would be a horrible thing. But I look at myself as a serviceman. I'm going to make this thing work again, and this is not a rare one-of-a-kind piece. So I put in a terminal block, which really helps when you're putting in the new electrolytic caps, and also replacing these caps that are inside this big black block here. But I did leave the original caps in place, so from the top it looks normal. You know, the old age and stress stuff really applies to all of us, but especially to resistors. This resistor, interestingly enough, was supposed to be 70 ohms, and I measured it at 58, which is within the 20% tolerance range, which I thought was very interesting. But it looked horrible, so I pulled it out. This is a more modern resistor. It just cracked in half. After I did the recap and replaced the obvious ugly parts before a complete recap, I powered it up slowly on a Variac, and the thing worked. So that was great. Then I finished the recap job, and it was, and then I had to go in and replace the grommets on the tuning capacitor because it was just rattling around. It wasn't shorting out, but the whole dial assembly is mounted on this, and so it was wobbling. So I had to. These are the 3 holes that these brass bushings are using grommets beneath them to isolate them from the chassis, and they line up with these 3 holes on the tuning capacitor. So I had to replace those. And there is the finished underside, and you can see there's new grommets there for the capacitor, and there's my terminal strip with the electrolytics on it. And I left some of the original resistors in because they were right on. And of course, most of the mica caps are in there okay, but all the other R's and C's got replaced, and it works great. Then on top, I went and decided to replace some of this cloth wire that just looked like the mice had been eating it. And what I did was I stripped back the insulation, and then I lap soldered in a new piece of cloth wire, and then I slid over a larger diameter piece of cloth wire, and then I slid that down over the wire in there, so the wire that I stripped in there can't touch the can. And then I glued it, and it looks better than heat shrink, I think. And again, the Smithsonian probably wouldn't approve of that. I didn't want to open up the whole IF transformer and do that job. The dial face was not in really good shape. There was a lot of self-inflicted damage on it from the thin foil puffing out, and then having the dial marker, tuning marker, scratch it. So it's thinner than normal aluminum foil that you would use in your kitchen or something. But it was all puffed away from the backing, so I took a piece of thin plastic and tried to shove some glue in there and kind of get it to be less puffy, at least in the area where the tuning pointer would go around. And so it wasn't a great job, and I'm sure I could buy a reproduction of this, but I got that kind of put back together. And there you see on the right what it looks like a little bit of gold paint covered up the scar there. And I also took the brass down to bare brass. I polished that with some Simichrome polish. And you know, some people like to leave the original patina. I figured I'll just get it down to brass and let the patina start reforming. And the nice thing about this radio is there's a sheet of glass right here protecting the dial. It's not plastic, so it's a little sturdier. And there is the finished product. And that's the end of my presentation. And I went to that website. They had some really good information there. There's the schematic if you're interested. And that's the end.
That's a beautiful job. As always,
Thanks.
you did another great restoration.
Nice job. When I strip a cabinet, what works for me is if you use the chemical stripper, then you got to use water to dilute and neutralize the stripper, which can raise the wood. So what I use, especially if it's a lacquer cabinet, is just use 50% lacquer thinner to 50% acetone, and then use a Scotch-Brite, and just, you know, keep cleaning the Scotch-Brite, but keep wiping it down, and you pull all that stuff off. And then you don't have to worry about having to neutralize that stripper, which, like I said, will raise the wood. At least that's what works for me.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Yeah, I realize that putting water on wood is a nasty proposition because it'll raise the grain. And
I might comment, I saw, Tom, you're using a cabinet scraper to scrape the lacquer, which is a great thing. I've heard a couple of people and say, have you ever tried to use a cabinet scraper like that? And they say, no, it says, it doesn't scrape very well. Well, the problem is that people don't know how to maintain the edge on a cabinet scraper. So once you find the secret handshakes to form the burr on the edge of the ground surface, it's a go-to tool for me, and highly recommended. So, and like you say, you didn't pull out the filler in the wood in that case, which is always for the good.
well, thanks for that comment, Robert. Yeah, I have difficulty using a cabinet scraper on curved surfaces, but it can be done. You just have to be very careful with it. But sometimes it's a combination of stripper and the scraper and solvents, but I try not to remove the grain filler if I can.
I was pleased to see that someone else remembers the Underwriters Knott when you replace the line cord.
Oh wow! You're
That's good.
All right, we got to go find that picture. Does anybody want to see what an Underwriter's Knot is? Does anybody know what an Underwriter's Knot is besides Matt? Oh, Robert does.
Yep.
Have not heard that term used for decades, but yeah, I remember hearing about it and knew how to do it at one time.
It's easy.
Let's go back to the picture of the chassis right there. You know, I don't normally use it, but for some reason I just used it this time. Sometimes I'll just use a grommet and just tie a knot, but a square knot. But, this is an Underwriter knot. So not an Undertaker's knot. That's a different knot.
That's when you don't put a knot. And you pull out the cord and it touches something.
I noticed your set has a Bakelite block under it. I just found these tools on eBay. There's a gentleman advertised them on Philco forum, and I guess they work pretty good. I haven't had a chance to use them yet, but basically it's just a drill that you break the connections within the eyelet holes, and you heat it up like you typically would. You use this other tool just to push it right out. There's a fellow named Bob Anderson. He does videos on YouTube. B. Anderson TV, I think is his handle, and he did a demonstration of this, and it looked like it worked pretty good. So I thought I'd give it a shot. If it's something that you do a lot of Bakelite blocks, you could look in on eBay. I think just type in Philco block tools and it'll pop up. I think there were $17 for the pair, but it might make the job a little easier.
I do the same thing, but I don't buy the tools. I have a little handle that's got a chuck on the end of it, and I put the appropriate size drill bit in it, and then I just use a hex key that's sitting in another chuck and pop out the block.
Yeah,
but it does the same thing. You don't spend $17 on it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for that opportunity to do the presentation. I thank myself, because I always thank the presenters. Are there any other questions on my presentation? If not, Matt will put up a poll right now to see if any of you are interested in giving a presentation, and I wish you can do so in the future. Okay, well, that concludes the presentation part of our video meeting, and now we're going to go to the show and tell. And I believe, based on the earlier poll, we have at least 2 show and tells. So whoever wants to jump in and start, please do so.
Okay, I'll bite the bullet. This is probably a minor item, but I was recently gifted with a Motorola 65T21 in pretty good condition. Blonde cabinet, no damage to it. And after checking things out, doing some cleaning and basic powering up, once again, the guardian angel of electrolytics was with me. Radio plays well with no trace of hum on all the original caps. But one thing I noticed was the chassis was installed with rubber cushions under each corner of the chassis, and the 2 mounting screws also went through rubber washers. And as you can guess, from 1949, these were pretty hard. And I thought, I'll be the lucky guy with a microphonic radio. So what can I do to replace these? What I finally came up with was for the washers. I don't know if I can hold this up close to my camera and you can see sort of what it looks like. Yeah, that's not too bad. I decided a easily reversible but good fix would be to apply clear Celastic around the flat washer assembly that went under this and stick them in place on the bottom of the cabinet, let it harden up, and now you've got a custom sized rubbery cushion. If you ever find authentic looking replacements, you can peel Celastic out and not leave a trace. The 4 corners under the chassis were a little bit tougher. Oops, there went one of them on the floor flying, just like in the shop. These were round with a metal. It turned out all they used was standard old eyelet rivets pressed into these round rubber cushions and then shoved up on each corner of the chassis. And I started thinking, well, if I could find rubber erasers thick enough, I'll just cut those, stick the eyelets in them, and do that for now, just so it's doesn't have any microphonic problems. Well, a couple of places I went to Hobby Lobby, and this stuff called Moo, yeah, it looks backwards there, a nice square white material that cuts very cleanly with an X-Acto. The eyelets that had been used came right out of the old rubber cushions. You could press them right into this. So now I have 4 white square rubber cushions under the chassis, but when I assembled everything, I got compression, clearance. I'll see how long the moo holds up. I'm not sure if the chassis might eventually cut through it, but I'll keep an eye on that. But at least I was able to resolve the issue of the old hardened rubber cushions so that the radio could be used and not have to worry about microphonic. The thing sounds great. It's the blonde cabinet. All the knob markings are 100% intact. The paper on the bottom is intact. And the only other bad thing was the line cord was completely crumbling. And Motorola didn't do an Underwriters Knott. They had a double fiber board at the back of the chassis that you had to try and wiggle a new cord through. So other than that, though, the radio plays great. And I just wish there was more on shortwave to listen to, because it seems to do pretty well hooked to the wire in the attic. But that's sort of my show and tell how I got around finding rubber cushions for this old radio.
Well, thanks, Ed. That's very creative.
And what was the name of that product again?
I found it at Hobby Lobby over in their one drawing section. It's from Korea. It's called Moo, M-O-O, just like the cow. And they had a flat one, which wasn't thick enough. And then I spotted this square one. And one of the ladies there was very helpful. She said, "Oh, I've got a piece of that out on our work table, so you can see what the material looks like." And it looked like it would be suitable. It had resilience to it.
Right, I was
And-
asking about the other product, the caulk-like material.
Oh, just plain clear Celastic is what I call it. Any clear bathtub caulk or anything. Those seem to keep their resilience for a long time. And then, like I say, if you ever find, say someone had Motorola mounting material available, you can peel the stuff right out and won't leave anything on the, and it's on the invisible part. It's on the bottom side of the cabinet anyway, where they had milled recesses. And
Okay.
can be formed right in, leave it set up overnight, and you're good to go.
The only problem with that silicone caulk, if it's got a vinegar smell, it's corrosive. So,
Yeah.
if you've got tube sockets or whatever close by, you're gonna have to probably clean up your tube sockets. But if you buy electrical silicone and it does not have, it won't have that vinegar smell.
Yeah,
If you buy
a lot-
something that does not have that vinegar smell, you'll be fine. But I just thought I'd mention that.
yeah. And since I was working on the cabinet by itself, I didn't have to worry about that. The chassis was on the table. And a lot of them now don't have the corrosive stuff in them. I think they're sort of getting away from it because it can corrode plumbing and stuff on you too.
Yeah, you can go to the store and get aquarium silicone and that'll be safe. Or, kitchen where you use it on a dishwasher or whatever,
Right.
and you'll be fine with that.
Yeah, they're, and it just takes a quick whiff of it to tell which kind you've got. So I had some stuff here that I knew was didn't have the sulfur stuff in it, and it, like I say, it's working fine, and the radio does not have a trace of hum in it. So the old electrolytic, everything in it. The other interesting thing was by 49, it looked like Motorola was still using up some pre-war style components under the chassis. But radio sounds great.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ed, for that. And the contributions on other other materials that you could use for this, the other silicones. Who else has a show and tell today?
I've got one I'd like to get some information on. Let me share some pictures.
Yes.
All right, so I've got this thing that's a teaching radio. And Concord Radio, from my research, was some people that left Lafayette Radio and started their own catalog house selling parts. It shows up in the late 40s Concord catalogs. I don't have those handy, so this just kind of jumped into my head while you guys were talking. So that's the logo, and then this is the whole radio on the wall. And I would estimate it's maybe up to 3 feet wide and 2.5 feet tall and about 3 inches deep. And to channel my Mr. Lozier, all these wax caps on the front are disconnected, and on the back there's modern capacitors. This thing plays, but it also has a really interesting feature which I didn't take a picture of. But you see these little silver things? These are snaps. You can actually disconnect the circuit at these points, and I'm sure they could inject signals or create defects or do whatever they wanted from a teaching viewpoint. It'd be wonderful if I could find the original manual that goes with this thing. I've searched the internet and there's no model number on this thing on here. There is a catalog number in the manuals, but that didn't come up with anything either. So if anybody knows anything about these things, I would really appreciate it. And that's all I got for now.
Thanks, Tom. That's a very interesting item you have there hanging on your wall.
Yeah, we're hoping to do some classes at the radio club, and I want to use this as our, one of our teaching tools, or maybe do something in a Zoom meeting and use it. In any case, I can obviously use it as is, but I'd like to see what they had in mind. Now, the other thing I'll comment on is these snaps are extraordinarily tight. I'm not sure that I would risk popping them off. This is just a masonite board that's painted, and you can see it had paint slopped down over here and somebody cleaned it up, but so it's not in pristine shape, but I don't want to make it any worse. And so anyway, I'm sorry,
I can only see the bottom corner of the board.
Yeah, we're looking at the zoomed in picture, Tom,
you
not
go
the
back?
wide.
Are we? Let me switch over. I thought I was on. I'm seeing the big one. So let me try this. Oh, let me hit new share. Let me see if that works. You guys see the big one now?
Yeah, now we got the big one.
Well, I did all that babbling for nothing because I could see it and you guys couldn't. So anyway, I'll just a quick recap. No pun intended. These little silver discs that are here that are kind of hard to see in the picture. That's where wires are snapped on top of each other, so you can break the circuit apart. Now, you probably could put a meter or a scope in there potentially, or, change the value of something. I don't know what exactly they had in mind. Sometimes they're up to 3 or 4 high. Sometimes they're just a single. And you can see they're all aligned up here too. And the antenna that's shown here in a graphic is actually on the back side of the cabinet. There's a loop antenna back there. And so that's the deal.
Yeah, that's real interesting, Tom. And I like your idea you're floating out there about maybe having some classes in the future. That's something we should explore.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of people that are staying away from buying radios that don't work because they don't know how they work, which is reasonable. But I think there's some people that would like to learn how.
Okay. Any other comments on Tom's unique item there?
I have a military piece of tube test and other equipment, and it uses a fuse type called S as in Sam, O as in Oscar, C as in Charlie. And it's 2 millimeters longer than AGC fuses. Any idea where I can get SOC fuses from? This is from the late 40s and probably in the war years.
What values do you, what values do you need?
Half amp, slow blow.
Half amp, slow blow. Put your question in the chat.
Okay.
That you need an SOC format, half amp slow blow fuses, and how to contact you. Email would be better than a phone number, just in case
Sure.
it's distributed to someplace weird and suddenly people from Nigeria are contacting you. But I'll have to check my stash. I mean, I when I see loose fuses, I tend to pick them up. I don't recall seeing an SOC, but you never know.
Northwest Electrical on, what is it, on Ram Road, Route 12.
Yeah, that's electrician stuff. That's not.
But they have stuff from the 30s to 40s that are sitting in the back room in bins. I've gone there many times and picked up all kinds of different oddball things that you wouldn't think they have.
Well, that's a good point. I didn't know that.
You put that name of that company in the chat because my audio is a little distorted.
Okay.
Second question is, I have a PAL Crosley very low boy radio. Speaker volume was exceedingly weak, and I think it's because the horseshoe magnet drive of the speaker, or at least at the speaker, is probably weak. Anybody know anything about remagnetizing horseshoe speakers magnets?
Well, I did it on the horseshoe magnets in my Model T Magneto, and we just made use of the coil adjacent to it. And after we made sure with a compass we were in the right location, and just powered the coil, and that magnetized the magnet. There are magnetizing devices out there that you actually physically put the magnet between, and that's an option. I guess it depends on the accessibility of this thing. You don't want to blow the speaker up either.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe we could continue that discussion in the open session. If there's more detail that could be added, Bill and Tom.
Thanks.
What I'd like to do now is kind of wrap up the show and tell section and move into item 5 on our agenda, which is the swap meet update. And here's where we just talk about the one we just had and when the next one's going to be. Tom, do you want to?
Yeah, I can do that.
Talk to that, and then when you're done, we could talk about the items.
I'm a two-finger lousy typer. So yeah, we just had a swap meet 2 weeks ago, and we were inside because it was raining. We had a small turnout. Only a few people selling because they had to be inside, which usually doesn't deter people a lot, but it did this time apparently. Thanks to Marshall, who was a club member, and I, we both loaded up our trucks with all the donation stuff from the club had in the storage locker. And thankfully, we sold or gave away or did something with almost all of it. I only had one box and 2 oscilloscopes that went back into storage. So the club grossed about $880 out of the sale. And if those people have been to the venue, we're in the American Legion Hall, and we usually use the main hall for the swap meet, but we have access to their bar area because of course it's not open on Sunday morning. And we filled all the tables in the bar area with the donation stuff to give you a flavor of how much stuff was there. So I would say that's at least 10 tables that are 6 foot long or so. Some of them maybe 8 footers, but it was a lot of tonnage. And that's, a comment I'd like to make to everybody is you guys need to have a plan for your estate. I mean, I don't want you to die, but you're going to. And a lot of people are contacting the club that are generally daughters and nieces for some reason of people that have left radio collections behind and they haven't got a clue what to do with the stuff. And so sometimes we help, I mean, I try and help them in any way I can, whether it gets it to auction, whether we help them sell it and by advertising it, or whether they donate it, or whatever it's going to work out, we try and do what's best for them. But there's people that have basements and garages that are absolutely jammed full of stuff. It's not like they have 2 sets sitting in the living room. So have a plan, even if you're just going to tell your spouse or your kids, you know, call this auction house or, you know, whatever, you know, get something together. Or, you know, I'm not advocating you liquidating before you stop having fun with it, but you may want to start getting rid of some of the excess. So that's the end of that commercial, and back to Tom.
Talk about today.
Well, I guess I'll just follow up on the last question. It is December 5th for the next meet. It's a swap meet. We have a Tektronix scope. That's a first generation solid state scope on a cart. And we have something that was out of either a military or power plant thing. It's just a pretty plain vanilla oscilloscope that works. That says nuclear something on it. So it's part of a big rack of something. Other than that, we just have some odds and ends, fortunately. And so there's nothing else that I have from a club viewpoint to offer.
Okay, thank you, Tom. As I mentioned earlier, there's something in the chat window. Ed Schumacher's got something in the chat window for sale. And if you have something, Larry Stark has got something in the chat window. So one thing to do right before the meeting closes is save the chat window. You can do that. And that way you have a record of what's for sale and all the other good information that's been put out there, like the websites that have been highlighted. So what we've got, if no one's got any other wanted items for sale, we'll just move to the open session here. And I'll stop being a moderator and let everybody just have at it.
I got one comment about a topical comment is that about a month ago, I came down with breakthrough COVID, and I'm over that, and I was really ticked off because I missed the Antique Wireless Association conference in Rochester. But one of the things that I've noticed is I lost my sense of smell. And what does that have to do with vintage radio? Well, I'm betting that a lot of you have been into storage areas and basements and other places that don't have humidity control. And you realize that there's a lot of mold and mildew that gets into collections, and now I'm not aware of that. So there may be parts of my house where I'm known to have some mold and mildew problems that mold and mildew may be having a gay old time there, and I can't smell it anymore. So. It's just one of the comments about how COVID has affected radio collectors.
Robert, I have a question for you specifically, because on that one restoration, you mentioned you've got a transformer replacer. I'd like to find out a little bit more about that, because my buddy's Philco Cathedral, I finally got to checking on it. And of course, it does have the open primary on the first audio transformer. And not knowing if you can even find those, that substitution circuit of yours, have you got one that works in the Philcos?
Well, right now I'm running low. I need to order a new batch of components for these, but they're designed for the typical two-winding, single primary, single secondary audio transformers like you would see in the 1920 through 27 type radios, and with voltages that are under 100 volts across the circuitry. So occasionally some of the early 1930s radios, the Philcos, that do happen to have a single primary, single secondary transformer in there. As we all know, a lot of times if you'll see where the voltage will rise actually pretty high before the other tubes start drawing current. So you could swing above the 100-volt rating of these devices.
Yeah, and
So,
my research online indicated that the open audio transformer was a not uncommon problem driving the pair of 71As. The primary was right on the B+, and I guess those took a hit fairly often.
yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone for a great meeting. And we'll see you next month in November.